Hi, I'm Glenda Cedarleaf, and welcome to this bedtime story. Tonight we'll be hearing the lovely musings and wonderings from Anne Shirley's whimsical imagination. Anne is the main character in LM Montgomery's touching book, Anne of Green Gables. Anne's ability to journey into an imaginative world helped her transcend the trauma of her childhood in the orphanage. The combination of her moment-to-moment awareness of the good things in life, as well as her endless imagination and creativity, brought her into a beautiful inner world filled with a deep sense of peace and joy and connection. This bedtime story is a collection of these reflections and some lovely descriptions of the natural world that surrounded her when she moved from Nova Scotia to Prince Edward Island in Canada. May her words help you relax and drift into sleep. Before we begin, I invite you to stretch your arms and legs, and then feel them sink into your bed. Let your neck and spine and shoulders now relax. Take a few moments to notice your breathing. Breathing in comfort, breathing in peace, breathing out the thoughts and cares of the day. Bring your attention inward, perhaps placing your hand on your belly, and feel the touch of your own skin. Come home to yourself. Where you can simply rest. And now, our story. We are at a train station. Anne is waiting to be picked up by Marilla Cuthbert. Matthew has ridden on his horse and buggy to supposedly meet a boy that he and his sister Marilla had requested from the orphanage to come and help with the farm chores. Instead, the orphanage has sent a girl, and here sits Anne, one who has yearned to have a home her whole life. Matthew, being a kind and sensitive soul, seems to intuit this yearning. So he decides to bring Anne home despite knowing that Marilla will be disappointed. Off they journey now together back to Green Gables. And this is when Matthew first experiences the vivid imagination of this young red-headed girl. He listens in wonder and veiled delight to Anne's seemingly endless streams of consciousness. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to imagine I was living here, but I never really expected I would. It's delightful when your imagination comes true, isn't it? It seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody. I used to lie awake at night and imagine belonging to someone. I guess that's why I'm so thin, because I was so busy imagining instead of sleeping. I do love to imagine. Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just makes me feel glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world, and it wouldn't be half so interesting if I knew all about everything, would it? There'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? Anne came out of her reverie with a deep sigh and looked at Matthew with the dreamy gaze of a soul that had been wandering afar, star-led. "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert," she whispered, "that place we came through, that white place, it was wonderful, wonderful. It's the first thing I ever saw that couldn't be improved upon by imagination. It just satisfies me in my heart. And the avenue, it's such a lovely place. But there's no meaning in its name, the avenue. They should call it, let me see, the White Way of Delight. Now, isn't that a nice imaginative name? Other people may call that place the avenue, but I shall always call it the White Way of Delight. Have we really only another mile to go before we get home? I'm glad, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry because this drive has been so pleasant. And I'm always sorry when pleasant things end. Something still pleasanter may come after, though, but you can never be sure. And it's so often the case that it isn't pleasanter. That's been my experience anyhow, but I'm glad to think of getting home. You see, I've never had a real home since I can remember. It gives me that pleasant ache just to think of coming to a really, truly home. Oh, isn't that pretty? Below them was a pond, looking almost like a river, so long and winding was it. A bridge spanned it midway, and from there to its lower end were an amber-hued belt of sandhills shut it in from the dark blue gulf beyond. The water was a glory of many shifting hues. The most spiritual shadings of crocus and rose and ethereal green, for which no name has ever been found. Above the bridge, the pond ran up into fringing groves of fir and maple and lay all darkly translucent in their wavering shadows. Here and there a wild plum leaned out from the bank like a white-clad girl tiptoeing to her own reflection. From the marsh at the head of the pond came the clear, mournfully sweet chorus of the frogs. There was a little gray house peering around a white apple orchard on a slope beyond. Although it was not yet quite dark, a light was shining from its windows. "That's Barry's Pond," said Matthew. "Oh, I don't like that name either. I shall call it, let me see, the Lake of Shining Waters. Yes, that's the right name for it. That suits exactly. It gives me a thrill." Do things ever give you a thrill? Anne continued to look about her. They were on the crest of a hill. The sun had set some time since, but the landscape was still clear in the mellow afterlight. To the west, a dark church spire rose up against a marigold sky. Below was a little valley, and beyond a long, gently rising slope, with snug farmsteads scattered along it. From one to another, Anne's eyes darted, eager and wistful. At last they lingered on one way to the left, far back from the road, dimly white with blossoming trees in the twilight of the surrounding woods. Over it, in the stainless southwest sky, a great crystal white star was shining like a lamp of guidance and promise. It was broad daylight when Anne awoke and sat up in bed, staring confusedly at the window through which a flood of cheery sunshine was pouring, and outside of which something white and feathery waved across glimpses of blue sky. Anne dropped on her knees and gazed out into the June morning, her eyes glistening with delight. Oh, wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it a lovely place? There was scope for imagination here. A huge cherry tree grew outside, so close that its boughs tapped against the house. And it was so thick, set with blossoms, that hardly a leaf was to be seen. On both sides of the house was a big orchard, one of apple trees and one of cherry trees, also showered over with blossoms, and their grass was all sprinkled with dandelions. In the garden below were lilac trees, purple with flowers, and their dizzily sweet fragrance drifted up to the window on the morning wind. Below the garden, a green field lush with clover sloped down to the hollow where the brook ran, and where scores of white birches grew, upspringing airily out of an undergrowth suggestive of delightful possibilities in ferns and mosses and woodsy things. Green and feathery with spruce and fir. There was a gap in it where the gray gable end of the little house she had seen from the other side of the lake of shining waters was visible. Off to the left were the big barns, and beyond them, sway down over green, low-sloping fields, was a sparkling blue glimpse of sea. Anne's beauty-loving eyes lingered on it all, taking everything greedily in. She had looked on so many unlovely places in her life, poor child, but this was as lovely as anything she had ever dreamed. She knelt there, lost to everything but the loveliness around her. The garden and the orchard and the brook and the woods, the whole big, dear world. Don't you feel as if you just love the world on a morning like this? And I can hear the brook laughing all the way up here. Have you ever noticed what cheerful things brooks are? They're always laughing. Even in a winter time, I've heard them under the ice. I'm so glad there's a brook near Green Gables. I shall always like to remember that there is a brook at Green Gables, even if I were never to see it again. If there wasn't a brook, I'd be haunted by the uncomfortable feeling that there ought to be one. I'm not in the depths of despair this morning. I never can be in the morning. Isn't it a splendid thing that there are mornings? It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly. I am not going to think about going back to the orphanage while we're having our drive. I'm just going to think about the drive. Oh, look, there's one little early wild rose out. Isn't it lovely? Don't you think it must be glad to be a rose? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? I'm sure they could tell us such lovely things. And isn't pink the most bewitching color in the world? The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the Gulf winds, grew thickly. On the left were the steep red sandstone cliffs. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks, or little sandy coves inlaid with pebbles, as with ocean jewels. Beyond lay the sea, shimmering and blue, and over it soared the gulls, their pinions flashing silvery in the sunlight. "Isn't the sea wonderful?" said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. "Once when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day, even if I had to look after the children all the time. I lived it over in a happy dream for years." Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull? I think I would. That is, if I couldn't be a human girl, don't you think it would be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water and away out over the lovely blue all day? And then at night to fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it now. Now I'm going to imagine things into this room so that they'll always stay imagined. The floor is covered with a white velvet carpet with pink roses all over it, and there are pink silk curtains at the windows. The walls are hung with gold and silver brocade tapestry. The furniture is mahogany. I never saw any mahogany, but it does sound so luxurious. This is a couch all heaped with gorgeous silken cushions, pink and blue and crimson and gold. And I am reclining gracefully on it. I can see my reflection in that splendid big mirror hanging on the wall. I am tall and regal, clad in a gown of trailing white lace, with a pearl cross on my breast and pearls in my hair. My hair is of midnight darkness, and my skin is a clear ivory pallor. My name is the Lady Cordelia Fitzgerald. No, it isn't. I can't make that seem real. Anne danced up to the little looking glass and peered into it. Her pointed freckled face and solemn gray eyes peered back at her. "You're only Anne of Green Gables," she said earnestly. "And I see you, just as you are looking now. Whenever I try to imagine I'm the Lady Cordelia. But it's a million times nicer to be Anne of Green Gables than Anne of nowhere in particular, isn't it?" She bent forward, kissed her reflection affectionately, and betook herself to the open window. "Dear Snow Queen, good afternoon. And good afternoon, dear birches down in the hollow. And good afternoon, dear gray house up on the hill. I wonder if Diana is to be my bosom friend. I hope she will, and I shall love her very much. But I must never quite forget Katie Maurice and Violetta. They would feel so hurt if I did, and I'd hate to hurt anybody's feeling. Even a little bookcase girls or a little echo girls. I must be careful to remember them, even though they're make-believe, and send them a kiss every day." Anne blew a couple of airy kisses from her fingertips past the cherry blossoms, and then, with her chin in her hands, she drifted luxuriously out on a sea of daydreams. "I do not like patchwork," said Anne dolefully. Today she was hunting out her work basket and sitting down before a little heap of red and white diamonds with a sigh. "I think some kinds of sewing would be nice, but there's no scope for imagination in patchwork. It's just one little seam after another, and you never seem to be getting anywhere. But of course I'd rather be Anne of Green Gables sewing patchwork than Anne of any other place, with nothing to do but play. I wish time went as quick as it does when I'm playing with Diana, though. Oh, we do have so much fun, such elegant times, Marilla. I have to furnish most of the imagination, but I'm well able to do that. Diana is simply perfect in every way. You know that little piece of land across the brook? It belongs to Mr. William Bell, and right in the corner there's a little ring of white birch trees. The most romantic spot, Marilla. Diana and I have our playhouse there. We call it Idlewild. I assure you it took me some time to think it out. I stayed awake nearly a whole night before I invented it. And then, just as I was dropping off to sleep, it came like an inspiration. Diana was enraptured when she heard it. We've got our house fixed up so elegantly. You must come and see it, Marilla, won't you? We have great big stones all covered with white moss for seats, and boards from tree to tree for shelves. And we have the fairy glass. Of course, they're all broken, but it's the easiest thing in the world to imagine that they are whole. There's a piece of a plate with a spray of red and yellow ivy on it that is especially beautiful. We keep it in the parlor, and we have the fairy glass there too. The fairy glass is as lovely as a dream. Diana found it in the woods behind their chicken house. It's all full of rainbows. Just little young rainbows that haven't grown big yet. And Diana's mother told her it was broken off of a hanging lamp they once had. But it's nice to imagine that the fairies lost it one night when they had a ball. Matthew's going to make us a table. Oh, we have named that little round pool over in Mr. Barry's field Willowmere. I got that name out of the book Diana lent me. That was a thrilling book, Marilla. The heroine had 5 lovers. I'd be satisfied with one, wouldn't you? She was very handsome, and she went through great tribulations. She could faint as easy as anything. I'd love to be able to faint, wouldn't you, Marilla? It's so romantic. But I'm really very healthy, even though I'm so thin. I believe I'm getting fatter, though. Don't you think I am? I look at my elbows every morning when I get up to see if any dimples are coming. I don't feel I could endure the disappointment if anything happened to prevent me from getting to the picnic. I suppose I'd live through it, but I'm certain it would be a lifelong sorrow. It wouldn't matter if I got to 100 picnics in after years. They wouldn't make up for missing this one. They're going to have boats on the Lake of Shining Waters and ice cream. As I told you, I've never tasted ice cream. Diana tried to explain what it was like, but I guess ice cream is one of those things that are beyond imagination. Marilla wore her amethyst brooch to church that day as usual. Marilla always wore her amethyst brooch to church. She would have thought it rather sacrilegious to leave it off. It would be like forgetting her Bible or her collection dime. That amethyst brooch was Marilla's most treasured possession. A seafaring uncle had given it to her mother, who in turn had bequeathed it to Marilla. It was an old-fashioned oval containing a braid of her mother's hair, surrounded by a border of very fine amethysts. Marilla knew too little about precious stones to realize how fine the amethysts actually were, but she thought them very beautiful and was always pleasantly conscious of their violet shimmer at her throat. Anne had been smitten with delighted admiration when she first saw that brooch. "Oh, Marilla, it's a perfectly elegant brooch. I don't know how you can pay attention to the sermon or the prayers when you have it on. I couldn't, I know. If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd go out into a great big field all alone, or into the deep, deep woods, and I'd look up at the sky, up, up, up into that lovely blue sky that looks as if there is no end to its blueness. And then I just feel a prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank Thee for the white way of delight and the lake of shining waters, and Bonnie and the Snow Queen. I'm really extremely grateful for them. Please let me stay at Green Gables, and please let me be good looking when I grow up. I remain yours respectfully, Anne Shirley. One wintry morning, Anne and Matthew crossed the long white field and walked under the glittering fairy arch of the Lover's Lane maples. Isn't it a wonderful morning? The world looks like something God had just imagined for His own pleasure, doesn't it? Those trees look as if I could blow them away with a breath. Poof. I'm so glad I live in a world where there are white frosts, aren't you? On a wintry night, Anne came dancing home in the purple winter twilight across the snowy places. Afar in the southwest was the great shimmering pearl-like sparkle of an evening star in a sky that was pale golden and ethereal rose over gleaming white spaces and dark glens of spruce. The tinkles of sleigh bells among the snowy hills came like elfin chimes through the frosty air, but their music was not sweeter than the song in Anne's heart and on her lips. You see before you a perfectly happy person, Marilla, she announced. I'm perfectly happy, in spite of my red hair. Just at present, I have a soul above red hair. Mrs. Barry kissed me and cried, and Diana and I had a lovely afternoon. Diana showed me a new fancy crochet stitch. Not a soul in Avonlea knows it but us, and we pledged in a solemn vow never to reveal it to anyone else. Diana gave me a beautiful card with a wreath of roses on it and a verse of poetry. It said, "If you love me as I love you, nothing but death can part us two." Spring had come once more to Green Gables. The beautiful, capricious, reluctant Canadian spring, lingering along through April and May in a succession of sweet, fresh, chilly days with pink sunsets and miracles of resurrection and growth. The maples in Lover's Lane were red-budded, and little curly ferns pushed up around the dryad's bubble. Away up in the barrens behind Mr. Silas Sloane's place, the mayflowers blossomed out, pink and white stars of sweetness under their brown leaves. All the schoolgirls and boys had one golden afternoon gathering them. Coming home in the clear, echoing twilight, with arms and baskets full of flowery spoil. I'm so sorry for people who live in lands where there are no mayflowers, said Anne. Diana says perhaps they have something better. But there couldn't be anything better than mayflowers, could there, Marilla? And Diana says if they don't know what they are like, they won't miss them. But I think that's the saddest thing of all. I think it would be tragic to not know what mayflowers are like and not to miss them. Do you know what I think mayflowers are, Marilla? I think they must be the souls of the flowers that died last summer, and this is their heaven. But we had a splendid time today, Marilla. We had our lunch down in the big mossy hollow by an old well. Such a romantic spot. We made wreaths of the mayflowers and put them on our hats. And when the time came to go home, we marched in procession down the road, 2 by 2, with our bouquets and wreaths, singing, "My Home on the Hill." It was so thrilling, Marilla. All Mr. Silas Sloane's folks rushed out to see us, and everybody we met on the road stopped and stared after us. We made a real sensation. Marilla, there's something in me today that makes me just love everybody I see. You don't know how good I feel. Wouldn't it be nice if it could last? I believe I could be a model child if I were just invited out to tea every day. One June evening, when the orchards were pink blossomed again, when the frogs were singing silvery sweet in the marshes about the head of the lake of shining waters, and the air was full of the savor of clover fields and balsamic fir woods. Anne sat by her gable window. She was studying her lessons, but it had grown too dark to see the book, so she had fallen into a wide-eyed reverie, looking out past the boughs of the Snow Queen, once more bestarred with its tufts of blossom. In all essential respects, the little gable chamber was unchanged. The walls were as white, the pincushion as hard, the chairs as stiffly and yellowly upright as ever. Yet the whole character of the room was altered. It was full of a new, vital, pulsing personality that seemed to pervade it, now quite independent of schoolgirl books and dresses and ribbons, and even of the cracked blue jug full of apple blossoms on the table. It was as if all the dreams, sleeping and waking, of its vivid occupant had taken a visible, although unmaterial form, and had tapestried the bare room with splendid, filmy tissues of rainbow and moonshine. The days of summer passed quickly. Soon it was September. A cool wind blew over the long harvest fields from the rims of furry western hills and whistled through the poplars. One clear star hung over the orchard, and the fireflies flitted over in Lover's Lane, in and out among the ferns and rustling boughs. As Anne watched them, somehow, she felt the wind and the stars and the fireflies were all tangled up together into something unutterably sweet and enchanting. When October arrived all red and gold, it was glorious. with mellow mornings when the valleys were filled with delicate mists, as if the spirit of autumn had poured in for the sun to drain. Amethyst, pearl, silver, rose, and smoke blue. The dews were so heavy that the fields glistened like cloth of silver, and there were such heaps of rustling leaves in the hollows of many-stemmed woods to run crisply through. The birch path was a canopy of yellow, and the ferns were sere and brown all along it. There was a tang in the very air that inspired the hearts of small maidens. They moved swiftly and willingly to school. Anne drew a long breath of happiness as she sharpened her pencil and arranged her picture cards in her desk. Life was certainly very interesting. Her new teacher became another true and helpful friend. Miss Stacy was a bright, sympathetic young woman with the happy gift of winning and holding the affections of her pupils and bringing out the best that was in each of them. And as the semester unfolded, Anne expanded like a flower in Miss Stacy's classroom. November came and went, and then it was December. And on the morning of Christmas, the world of Green Gables was gifted with a beautiful white dusting of snow. It had been a very mild December, and people expected a green Christmas. But just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delightful eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and the wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples. And there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. Merry Christmas, Marilla. Merry Christmas, Matthew. Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? Meanwhile, Matthew was sheepishly unfolding a gift. Anne then realized it was for her. Matthew held it out to her, and Anne took and opened the box. It was a dress. She looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was. A lovely, soft brown gloria with all the gloss of silk. A skirt with dainty frills and shirrings. A waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves, they were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them 2 beautiful puffs divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. That's a Christmas present for you, Anne, said Matthew shyly. Why, Anne, don't you like it? Well, now. Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. Like it? Oh, Matthew. Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream. Well, let's have breakfast, interrupted Marilla. I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in. I don't see how I'm going to be able to eat breakfast, said Anne rapturously. Breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puff sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl, indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl. And I always resolve that I will be in the future. But somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this. When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. Merry Christmas, Diana. And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas. I've something special to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress, with such sleeves I couldn't even imagine any nicer. The winter days passed on, and soon it was spring. Anne and Diana were invited to Miss Barry's to attend a concert in the Academy of Music. In Miss Barry's world, imagination and creativity were the center of life, and so on this evening, Anne experienced it as a glittering vision of delight. When it was over, Miss Barry said, "I hope you enjoyed yourselves." "Indeed we have," said Diana. "And you, Anne girl?" "I've enjoyed every minute of the time," said Anne, throwing her arms impulsively about the old woman's neck and kissing her wrinkled cheek. And Miss Barry found herself thinking less about Anne's quaint speeches than of her fresh enthusiasms, her transparent emotions, her little winning ways, and the sweetness of her eyes and lips. "I thought Marilla Cuthbert was an old fool when I heard she'd adopted a girl out of an orphanage," she said to herself. "But I guess she didn't make much of a mistake after all. If I'd a child like Anne in the house all the time, I'd be a better and happier woman." Anne and Diana found the drive home as pleasant as the drive in, pleasanter indeed, since there was a delightful consciousness of home waiting at the end of it. It was sunset when they passed through the white sands and turned into the shore road. Beyond the Avonlea hills, they came out darkly against the saffron sky. Behind them, the moon was rising out of the sea that grew all radiant and transfigured in her light. Every little cove along the curving road was a marvel of dancing ripples. The waves broke with a soft swish on the rocks below them, and the tang of the sea was in the strong, fresh air. "It's good to be alive, and good to be going home," breathed Anne. When she crossed the bridge over the brook, the kitchen light of Green Gables winked her a friendly welcome back, and through the open door shone the hearth sending out its warm red glow. Amidst the chilly night, Anne ran blithely up the hill and into the kitchen, where a hot supper was waiting on the table. She couldn't wait to tell Marilla all about her adventure. Marilla, it was beyond description. I was so excited I couldn't even talk. I just sat in enraptured silence. Madame Zelinsky was perfectly beautiful, and she wore white satin and diamonds. But when she began to sing, I never thought about anything else. Oh, I can't tell you how I felt. But it seemed to me that it could never be hard to be good anymore. I felt like I do when I look up at the stars. Tears came into my eyes, but oh, they were such happy tears. I was so sorry when it was all over, and I told Miss Barry I didn't see how I was ever to return to common life again. She said she thought if we went over to the restaurant across the street and had an ice cream, it might help me. That sounded so prosaic, but to my surprise, I found it true. The ice cream was delicious, Marilla, and it was so lovely and dissipated to be sitting there eating it at 11 o'clock at night. Diane said she believed she was born for city life. Miss Barry asked me what my opinion was, but I said I'd have to think it over very seriously before I could tell her what I really thought. So I thought it over after I went to bed. That's the best time to think things out. And I came to the conclusion, Marilla, that I wasn't born for city life, and that I was glad of it. It's nice to be eating ice cream at brilliant restaurants at 11 o'clock at night once in a while. But as a regular thing, I'd rather be in the East Gable at 11, sound asleep, but kind of knowing even in my sleep that the stars were shining outside, that the wind was blowing in the firs across the brook. Spring came and went, and now it was summer. But on this night it was still cool enough for a fire. Anne was curled up Turk fashion on the hearth rug, gazing into that joyous glow where the sunshine of 100 summers was being distilled from the maple cord wood. She had been reading, but her book slipped to the floor, and now she was dreaming with a smile on her parted lips. Glittering castles in Spain were shaping themselves out of the mists and rainbows of her lively fancy. Adventures, wonderful and enthralling, were happening to her in Cloudland. Adventures that always turned out triumphantly and never involved her in scrapes like those of actual life. The next day, Anne walked down the long hill that sloped to the lake of shining waters after sunset. All Avonlea lay before her in a dream-like afternight. She called it a haunt of ancient peace. There was a freshness in the air, as of a wind that had blown over honey-sweet fields of clover. Home lights twinkled out here and there among the homestead trees. Beyond lay the sea, misty and purple, with its haunting, unceasing murmur. The west was a glory of soft mingled hues, and the pond reflected them, all in still soft shadings. The beauty of it all thrilled Anne's heart, and she gratefully opened the gates of her soul to it. She returned home and went up to her room. There she sat at her window. The wind purred softly in the cheery boughs, and the mint breaths came up to her. The stars twinkled over the pointed firs in the hollow, and Diana's light gleamed through the old gap. Anne sat long at her window that night, companioned by a glad content. Anne could see her future ahead of her. Her next path had flowers of quiet happiness blowing along its borders. The joys of sincere work and worthy aspiration and congenial friendship were to be hers. Nothing could rob her of her birthright of fancy or her ideal world of dreams. "Dear old world," she murmured, "you are very lovely, and I am so glad to be alive in you." And now we've come to the end of our story. So I wish you sweet dreams and good night.